I want to start with this image that you see from a show that I did last year with the Singapore Art Museum. At the time, the curator that I worked with, Shabir Mustafa, had asked me to think about my earlier works that seemed to be the foundation or the source for my later works. This text-based artwork that you see is a collection of 24 rules for cities that I imagine could help citizens express their architectural desires. The rules included some truly ridiculous ones, like students would be posted to a school far away if they failed their geography exam so that they'd be forced to travel through more of the city and learn about it in the process. I guess Singapore is the only place I've really known besides the other city that I've lived in is London. So Singapore itself and its urban environment has always been a really big influence on the work that I make. A couple of years ago, I was also very curious about researching my family tree and where we came from, maybe in southern China. My father's side, he traces his family back to Malaysia, where there is a new village in Perak in the west coast of the Malaysian peninsula. But actually just tracing to the new village in Malaysia is really, really hard with all the language barriers in English, Malay, Chinese, and the Fuzhou dialect that I don't speak. So if we were to talk about where the old village is in China, I do not know where my family's old village is. At university, I had actually studied English literature. This is a mind map that shows a bit of what I have done, what all the things that I'm interested in. At the time I went to uni, there wasn't a way to study art or how to make visual work. So I could think of poetry and literature as the purest and closest to studying art. Because I really wanted to make visual work, I ended up teaching myself how to do flash animation and an action script that was very popular back then. I ended up working in advertising and making design work. I always thought that working in advertising was a bit like my design school. Some years later, I managed to go to the Royal College of Art in London on a visual arts scholarship, but I chose to study design there under Dunn and Raby, who are known mainly for their speculative design work. Ultimately, I think you would say that I'm an artist who is trained in design, but I use that design skill to produce art. Today, I'll try to talk about 4 of the works that I have worked on in the past. The first 2 are about the Singapore River, and the latter 2 looking at some of the virtual reality works I've made. For me, I think a very big part of how I make works always started with maps. There are maps that I make for fun, just for every day to navigate. It also translated to one of the earliest projects I made, which was trying to draw the dreams that I had as maps. The thing that you see on the left is actually a map of when I first moved to London, and it was very hard to navigate. So I drew a ton of maps to navigate myself in the city. This picture is actually of 100 of the dream maps that I had, which I later, tried to make into a book, thinking about how I would translate something as intangible as a dream into a visual format. And I thought the map at the time was the best way to do it. Another thing is that when a lot of people tend to write their dreams as stories or they write it out, but in there's already a kind of translation. I always felt that since it was in your mind when you dream, it's all visual. Why couldn't I try to represent it as something visual? So this is the book. For me, a big part of my practice had been about walking, seeing the city from the ground view like this before the COVID and before I had a young baby. Besides walking on the ground, the other perspective I really enjoy seeing is when you go from the aerial view or the top of buildings. That's one thing I'm also quite obsessed with. These are some pictures, me going to the top of things where you get a very different perspective of the world. And I always like to use this image of the Mars selfie. This is the Mars rover, which is a machine that has sent out to the furthest reaches of what we can travel to Mars, the planet. And thinking about how humans have this great fascination for the things that almost beyond our perceptual boundaries. We can't go to Mars, but yet we have a desire to see and try to understand the world around us. This is another picture of a reconnaissance plane, which is seeing the planet Earth. There is a thing that they call the overview effect. When they fly so high up into low Earth orbit, they can see the planet as this ball hanging in the void. And people's reaction to seeing it are often quite different. Some people think, oh, we must protect it. But for others, maybe they have other thoughts when they see this. This is a picture of a cake I saw at the conference some years ago. It was by the designer Yona Gaynor. I have a story to tell you about this cake that I saw. This cake was actually meant to represent her artwork, which was imagining if you have a party when you have decided to cut up all of the planet Earth, to use it to build all the spaceships so that we can fly to other planets to colonize them and build more Earth satellites. Funny thing about this cake is that this cake had been at the conference for 4 days. And after 4 days, it was almost not very cake-like. Nobody wanted to eat this artwork cake anymore. One of the questions I always asked people when I was a child is this question of what is a scallop? if you ask Singaporeans, you always get different answers. This is a picture of actually what probably, if you ask what a scallop is, this is what they think. They think it looks like cake. I remember when I had my first solo show, I was trying to ask one of the people helping me with the show to get me this scallop edge tablecloth, which looks like this. But she didn't understand what a scallop edge tablecloth was supposed to be. For most of us, we never ever see the scallop shell. So there isn't that understanding of this scallop edge because the assumption is that scallop is cake. Another picture I want to show you is the logo for Singapore Tourism Board's brand in 2010. It was composed of these squares with the word Your Singapore on top of it, which is quite hard for maybe people from outside of Singapore to understand what on earth this is. And what you're seeing, of course, for Singaporeans is that you know that this is the map of Singapore. But how you know if you've never been to Singapore, if this was a brand for tourism? For me, I've always thought about Singapore as a kind of almost black hole of meaning that a lot of people are trying to stuff this different meaning in. This is a picture started the work that I'm going to show you next. There is this signboard that is by the Singapore River. The Singapore River is where Singapore's economic and history starts. It is where the British sailed in and actually landed there and built the colonial city. It's where all the trade starts from. So Singapore's identity is heavily written by the Singapore River. But when you go there, there isn't very much info about it. This is from 2009. There were these empty notice boards and it was just being stuffed with rubbish every time I walked past. I think another important thing is that most countries don't call their rivers like London River. They give it actual names. Nobody knows where in Singapore is the Singapore River when its name is the same. And when you speak to Singaporeans and ask them, how does it connect with other water bodies? I always felt like even though the river was so short, it was only about 4 km, people would not know where on earth they were. They didn't even know where they were in relation to this river. So it made me want to ask people and find out what they thought the Singapore River looked like. And these are some of the sketches that I would get back. I would realize that every time I asked people to draw the river for me, they would draw something totally different. Here are some more pictures of what they imagined, which I translated into other map forms. People would draw this as the Singapore River, another picture of the Singapore River as connecting the reservoir. This is geographically inaccurate. And thinking of it more impressionistically, this is not what it looks like. And, like this, or even like a lake. So it led me to want to make a bigger map work to represent the Singapore River, where I could think of it as a kind of almost psychogeographical fault line. It was okay for it to mean completely different things for people, where I could get the audience to sort of give their stories, whether or not they were real, imaginary, myth, or fake stories about the river. And I wanted to collect all these kind of stories about the Singapore River. So these are some of the stories that came back from them. Everybody could write their stories and you can see the green dots there. So when people came, they would indicate that stories they believed, they hoped were real. They add these green stickers on it. And I was going to archive all of these stories in the website. So you can see some more pictures here of the sort of map upon which all the stories are being collected. This is the archive of it. Some of the stories that came back were very humorous. This is a picture of supposedly Lee Kuan Yew's art. Lee Kuan Yew was the former Prime Minister of Singapore. They were imagining elephants on top of this arc, a very famous building. So what it reads is, forward-looking city builds an arc in anticipation of rising sea level. This one, of course, refers to this popular building. It does look like this. And another story, this is someone wrote UFO, which is meant to be like an alien spaceship, which leads to this structure. It's actually this building. And one of the stories I received was also one that I couldn't verify at first. It was about someone who had found 14th century pot shards in Pulau Saigon's construction site. At that time, I didn't really know much about Pulau Saigon itself when I was doing this project. If you look in the historical records, there aren't really a lot of things to find about it. And that year when I was looking for it, there was a misspelling on streetdirectory.com, which is one of the map providers in Singapore at the time. And even they had renamed the Pulau Saigon Bridge with the wrong name on the thing. So this site of Pulau Saigon was quite intriguing for me. At the time, because I had been making all these map works, I had the opportunity to show some of my interactive map works alongside a cabinet from John Mixick, the earlier person in that story, who had collected the 14th century pot shards. He's an archaeologist in Singapore for many years. And so in one of the years, I had a chance to actually see those items from Pulau Saigon in person. These artifacts from Pulau Saigon were really tiny. It was being shown in a massive hall, but the objects and artifacts themselves were really a bit disappointingly small and inconsequential. And this picture is actually the map of Pulau Saigon. What you see here is actually the island in the Singapore River. And most people don't know that there has ever been an island in the river, because today it doesn't exist. It's been leveled, it's been flattened entirely, not by design, but by silting, erosion. So over time, if you ask anybody from my generation or even my parents' generation, nobody knows what's Pulau Saigon. What exactly was Pulau Saigon? I really wanted to know more about that. So this is a picture of the map of Pulau Saigon. It had been on the street directory up to about 1975. If you go to older maps from the 70s, they're still there. It had a railway station, warehouses, and quite a lot of things on it. It had also 2 big metal bridges connected to the mainland. During World War II, when there was a bombing near to the mainland, the fire had spread across on these metal bridges to the other side. Pulau Saigon also caught fire. I guess the weird part about it is that there were actually things on this island, and it seemed really odd for me to think that a geographical feature like having an island in the river in the center of Singapore just disappeared without fanfare. There were also misnamings of it. Nobody knew its origin or why it's called Saigon even. I was very fortunate to find this catalogue for this archaeological dig that had been done in the Pulau Saigon site. But at the time, what I did is that I wrote to Jennifer Barry, who had written the book in the UK. To my amazement, she was still at the mailing address that was at the back of the book. She actually sent me a copy of this record of what had been found at the archaeological dig on the island in the 80s. This is actually some pictures of trying to meet Jennifer Barry, who was an archaeologist who made the dig back then in Singapore. I'm also showing you other pictures here of another article from the newspaper, which actually talks about how this site had been found by an amateur archaeologist, Mr. Koh Lian Huat. Mr. Koh Lian Huat was interested in collecting Neolithic wares, but he saw these things at this site and he alerted the university in Singapore to look into this site. I think it's also worth noting that in Singapore, archaeological work isn't something that takes a lot of precedence over construction. So when any kind of archaeological dig happens, they have to do it in 2 weeks. They have no time, they have very little resources. They just have to dig everything now quickly. This is actually a picture of Mr. Koh Lian Huat. He's the one in the middle. One interesting thing is that when I talked to him, he was trying to understand the site in his own way, in visual ways as well. He was always making these rubbings. He was also making these weird sketches of fragments. He was actually turning it around, sketching it in different directions, trying to understand what on earth he had found, whether it was of significance. And that was his way of trying to understand the kind of lost histories as well. When I went to visit NUS, the National University of Singapore, where they had the archaeological fragments from Pulau Saigon, even when I went to see it myself, it was really hard to understand what on earth I was looking at. A lot of the things were very broken, very rusted. In fact, when you see the artifacts, you may not be blown away. Instead, you'll be like, that's it? That's very mundane. They were almost objects that maybe a child walking past dropped in the river. For me also, that was fascinating because it kind of connects to your everyday life as well. You think of that time of this lost island that we don't know much about, and then think about the objects that were there. Could we try to recreate what on earth the island was like? So what I wanted to make was kind of like a process to unforget the things. Like, could I just put in the name of the things and then produce an object for it? And to say unforgetting, specifically to acknowledge that there's no way to remember the thing because we don't know what Pulau Saigon was like anymore. There aren't really the records to show what it was exactly like. The only thing I can do is to try to unforget it a little. I mean, the term for me is an important distinction. Some of the images here show how I was thinking about the ways to produce it using scripting. I wanted to think of a process for producing it, thinking about how I could use technology, scripts like neural networks, deep learning, and also thinking about how we classify images over time has changed. Some more pictures of it. I will just skip through this because I think the point of it is all that pictures showing the technology is to ask what is a monitor, for example. You're probably staring at your monitor. What would be the essence of it? Is it just a box, like a frame? Is that what a monitor is? What is the thing to everyone? When we talk of a spoon, what is a spoon to people? What's a scallop? So this is also at the heart of asking, what do people think things look like? This is thinking also where exactly the art of it, because you also think about knowledge as something that's formed from all these tagged images of what we think a thing is. The art is also in that accumulation of that network's knowledge. Thinking about how is art formed also from all these networks of knowledge, and also in the attempt to translate the thing. Just to show you a bit about how the work was produced, for example, the word asbestos. Asbestos is a material that was used for insulation, but is also very toxic material that is previously used for construction. So a search for all the pictures of asbestos were taken. and then it translated to a sketch of it in code, trying to make parametric form of the object. If I change one parameter in the code, it would produce a slightly different version of the object. So this is the example of asbestos. Besides asbestos, I use the same process to try to come up with the shapes for a lot of different objects, only by programming. A lot of these are formed by trying to take an outline of an object and turn it into a 3D object. This is not modeled like by hand. This is all scripts only. Finally, I wanted to make it into something that people could hold on to, examine. So they were all fabricated using 3D printing. There was a lot of errors along the way trying to fabricate it. But in the end, the prototype itself is also something that casts the artist as a facilitator of that whole artistic process. It's a bit like a collaboration with a machine. Can a machine really collaborate with you, So you see here the prototypes. This is all of the objects from the library of Pulau Saigon. Rather than for me to make up a story of a place that we don't really have the facts of, we had this library of objects that people would come in and hold and wonder, what on earth is Pulau Saigon? I was very fortunate to be able to show the work at the Archaeology Library in the National University of Singapore Museum. This archaeology library also holds all of the original artifacts from Pulau Saigon itself. One of the things I want to say about why I love this museum so much is that there is a whole exhibition of beautiful pottery from China, from India. They are gigantic and they are beautiful, really amazing pottery from all over the world. And then you come to the Singapore section, which is all broken up like this. All the fragments like a jigsaw puzzle that you need to put together. As an artist, I always thought of myself as someone who is there to investigate and figure out what is the storyline of it, to put together all these pieces of the puzzle in the story of Pulau Saigon. This is actually the exhibition view where the original artifacts were in the front of the work. In the background, this is the work. There is a list of the items on the wall, but the objects are there for people to pick up and interact with. I think it's really important for it to be an object that you handle in a way, because sometimes if you don't have any reality or things to hold on to, you can't even put time to even think about what are the histories that are lost. And this is where it's actually being displayed right now in the NUS Museum, where it's in their permanent exhibition, Radio Malaya. After some time when I'd done this project, I discovered that the Chinese tight spoon of my image was also being found inside that search, of all the images. Since a lot of the source material for my project had been things like the Google images for the keyword, it's kind of almost feeding back into the data source for my project.